This video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. In January 1596, a lead-lined coffin was lowered from the side of the warship Defiance into the turquoise waters of the Caribbean off the coast of Panama. Within the coffin lay the body of a stocky Englishman in his 50s. The fleet and soldiers he had commanded here in the West Indies had recently failed to take the Spanish city of Panama by force, and soon the English expedition would return home without him. It was a quiet and rather ignominious end to a life filled with the grandest adventures imaginable. And yet being buried at sea off the Spanish Main was also a fitting end for this illustrious soldier. He had risen from his lowly birth to challenge the power of the greatest empire on earth, that of mighty Spain. His attacks on Spanish ships, towns and ports in the Caribbean, the Pacific and on Iberia itself had frustrated and terrorised Spanish governors, admirals, King Phillip II and even the Pope in Rome. During his lifetime, he was the most famous, most admired and most feared man in Christendom. He robbed Spanish gold and silver from the jungles of Panama, seized laden treasure ships from the Azores to the Pacific, and helped save England from the terrifying Spanish Armada. The first captain to successfully circumnavigate the globe, he was without doubt the finest navigator, most accomplished explorer, and wealthiest pirate of his age. But who was this man really? What caused him to sail around the world and spend a lifetime seeking fame and fortune at sea? And why was he so motivated to wage an endless personal war against the entire Spanish Empire? This is the story of England's greatest hero, Sir Francis Drake. Surfshark VPN is an online protection tool that keeps your online identity safe by encrypting all the information sent between your device and the internet, keeping your personal data protected from big companies or cyber criminals. Also, a VPN swaps the real location of your device with a new one by changing your IP address. This way, you can virtually circumnavigate the globe. Surfshark has over 3,200 servers in 100 countries, so you can access and unblock content libraries and streaming services from other countries. And if you're actually traveling the world, you can change your virtual location back to your home country whenever you need to. While when you're out and about using free public Wi-Fi, a VPN encrypts your online data and helps to secure your personal information from hackers. So please use the link in the description below to get an exclusive Surfshark Black Friday deal. Enter promo code DDHISTORY to get up to 6 additional months for free. And Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk to try it out. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring the video. To understand the man he became and why he accomplished the things he did, we must first know where he came from and the world he was born into. Francis Drake was born in about the year 1540 in the town of Tavistock in Devon, not far from the famous English port of Plymouth. Throughout his adult life, Drake would remain closely associated with Devon and Plymouth, but he did not grow up there. When Drake was a boy, his father left for the county of Kent, taking his family with him, where on the River Medway they lived together in a hulk. The Medway was where the ships of the Royal Navy at this time were laid up and repaired. The young Francis would have seen these grand warships up close, and surely they made a powerful impression on the boy. In fact, Drake's father made his living as a preacher, reading prayers to the men of the King's Navy. And Francis was born into a time of enormous religious unrest that would shape his actions throughout his life. The conflict of the age was between Catholicism and Protestantism. After the Protestant Reformation earlier in the century, the wars of religion would be waged within states and between them. As a kingdom, England was Protestant, as were most of its people, and throughout his life, Francis would be a committed Protestant, motivated by his belief in God to oppose Catholics everywhere. Francis was the oldest of 12 brothers, although some died in infancy, and his father did his best to educate them before sending them off to be apprenticed. Sometime in the 1550s, the young Francis, when he was about 12 or so, was apprenticed to the owner and master of a small bark which carried freight around the region and on occasion sailed to France and the Low Countries. This was when Drake learned the business of sailing a ship, of navigation and handling its cargo and crew. He experienced the hardships of life aboard, the cramped and wet quarters, the relentless watches and unwholesome food. Perhaps in these coastal waters, and while crossing the Channel and the North Sea, he also had a small taste of the freedom and adventure that the sea promised. Over the next few years, he learned his business well and was beloved by his master. So much so that when the childless old man died, he left his bark, a 3-masted ship, to his teenaged apprentice. This was a remarkable stroke of good fortune and is a sign of the high regard the young man was held in. As the owner of such a relatively substantial vessel, the profitable life of a coastal trader beckoned. The route ahead was mapped before him, and he merely had to sail it in order to make his living, buy a house, seek a wife and start a family, and even to help his younger brothers to get their start. But Francis Drake was never a man to take the easy route in life, or to think small. Instead, he took a great risk in the hopes of turning his good fortune into a greater future. So, rolling the dice, not for the last time in his life, he swiftly sold that bark and made his way back to his homeland, the beautiful and wild county of Devon. He did this to take advantage of a family connection to wealthy shipowners and traders in Plymouth named William and John Hawkins. It's often said that they were Drake's cousins, but it's not actually clear what the relationship was. However, Drake was a distant kinsman, and as an educated man with years of sailing experience, he now sought employment on their future voyages. He also brought with him from Kent a few of the crewmen he had retained from the ship he had just sold, which speaks to Drake's leadership qualities and ambition, even at such a young age. He was employed by the Hawkins brothers as the purser on a voyage to northern Spain in about 1564, a position of some importance. This was an era when Portugal and Spain had grown unbelievably wealthy through trade with the New World, Africa, and the East. England, on the other hand, had achieved little in long-distance trade. The Hawkins family was one of the few to engage in trade beyond Europe, trading in Africa for ivory and other commodities and crossing the Atlantic to barter with the natives of Brazil. And inspired by the Portuguese and Spanish, John Hawkins saw another great business opportunity to get involved in: trading in slaves. Hawkins commanded 2 expeditions to Africa in 1562 and 1565 to acquire a few hundred slaves that he sold to the Spanish in the West Indies. These were considered illegal incursions into their territory by the Spanish and Portuguese. The concept of free trade did not exist, and there were proper procedures to follow and fees to pay for all Iberian merchants. The Spanish crown instructed governors in the Caribbean not to trade with Hawkins, but palms were greased and threats were made, and the trades happened anyway. The Spanish complained to Queen Elizabeth, but leading men of her court, and even the Queen herself, were financial backers of these voyages. In 1566, Drake joined a third Hawkins-backed voyage. A small fleet, under the command of John Lovell, sailed to Cape Verde off the coast of Africa and set about plundering Portuguese merchant vessels and seizing their cargo of goods like ivory, sugar, and slaves. Drake was serving as an officer on one of these ships, sailing further than he'd ever gone before and learning the business of piracy on the high seas. Having filled their holds with pillage, the fleet crossed the Atlantic to sell it to the Spanish in the West Indies. The Spanish refused to trade, however, and the slaves were released on land without any payment, and the small fleet returned home. We can only imagine the effect this all had on the young Francis Drake. What did he make of the sights of these tropical seas under blazing skies, the strange smells of new lands, and the degrading business of slaving? A year later, the final Hawkins transatlantic trading fleet set out, and again Drake joined it as an officer. It would be a voyage that radically transformed the path of his life, and eventually that of England and Spain. This time there were 6 ships, 2 of them warships belonging to Queen Elizabeth, the massive but ancient Jesus of Lubeck, commanded by John Hawkins, and the smaller but newer Minion. Drake served aboard the Jesus as an officer. It was a huge ship with towering castles fore and aft, but it was an old and leaky vessel. Originally, the voyage was meant to find gold mines in Africa, but after their 2 Portuguese guides ran away, Hawkins decided to obtain goods, mainly slaves, to sell in the West Indies instead. To get slaves, they plundered them from Portuguese vessels, and they resorted to raiding a coastal settlement for its men. The attack did not go well. They kidnapped 9 African men, but lost 7 or 8 crewmen to their poison arrows. While off the African coast, Drake was given command of a Portuguese caravel, commandeered from a French pirate fleet who had recently seized it. The English continued to snap up Portuguese vessels and take their slaves, and they failed in an attack on a Portuguese settlement. Around Sierra Leone, Hawkins was invited by local chiefs to join them in an attack on their enemies who were currently invading their territory. Hawkins agreed to aid the chiefs in exchange for keeping any prisoners taken as slaves. With the support of cannon from their ships, they breached the enemy fort and attacked the settlement. The Englishmen were horrified to witness their allies eating some of the prisoners right there on the battlefield, but Hawkins secured about 250 of them in exchange for about 8 or 9 losses from his own crew. Now with about 400 slaves in the holds, Hawkins' fleet crossed the Atlantic to sell them in the West Indies. All seemed to be going well, but the voyage was destined to end in disaster. After reaching the Caribbean, they made a couple of stops at Spanish ports in the islands for provisions and small trades before the fleet made its way to the Spanish Main and the town of Rio de la Hacha in modern Colombia. Drake was now in command of a small ship called the Judith, and, along with another called the Angel, went ahead to find out what kind of reception they would receive from the Spanish. Approaching the port looking for fresh water to anchor there and to trade, the small ships were fired on by cannons from the shore. The English fired back, and one cannonball smashed through the local governor's house. Withdrawing out of range, the English vessels blockaded the port and awaited the rest of the fleet. Hawkins wrote asking for permission to trade his slaves, and the Spanish governor said no. Hawkins decided to force the Spanish to trade with him by landing 200 men and assaulting the town by land. After firing a single volley, the assembled Spaniards defending the town fled into the woods, and the English took it. The governor destroyed crops and provisions to deny them to the English, while the English burned about 20 houses, including the governor's. It was a stalemate until a local slave defected to the English and said that if they freed him, he would tell them where the Spanish had hidden their treasures. He led them 6 miles out of town to a cache of possessions, including some treasure bound for Spain. Hawkins offered to return it all and leave the town in exchange for a ransom if the governor would only trade fairly with him. Ultimately, Hawkins sold 200 slaves and moved on. This experience was important for Drake because not only would he emulate this ransoming of Spanish towns he learned from Hawkins, Drake also learned from this alliance with a disaffected slave. Hawkins, however, did not view Africans in the same way that Drake did, and Hawkins broke his word to the man who had delivered him victory, leaving the slave behind for the Spanish, who immediately executed him. At the town of Santa Marta, Hawkins again threatened the locals and offloaded 110 slaves before trying it again at Cartagena. That city was far too powerful, however, and Hawkins left, deciding it was time to head for home with the profits he had made. With 8 remaining ships, they sailed northwards to pass around Cuba by the Yucatan and Florida and on into the Atlantic. God, however, had other ideas, and a violent storm drove most of the fleet deep into the Gulf of Mexico, battering the ships badly. Eventually, they limped into the port of San Juan de Ulúa in Mexico. It was a small place, but provided a good harbour and served as an outlet for nearby Veracruz. The local governors rowed out to meet the English ships, thinking it was their own Spanish fleet arriving on its annual crossing to and from Mexico, bringing supplies and men and taking back gold and silver for the homeland. They were dismayed to discover Englishmen instead, but Hawkins swore that the battered English fleet meant them no harm and intended only to refit before heading home. England and Spain were religious and political adversaries, but they were not in a state of war. The English anchored and began to repair their ships, but just 2 days later, the expected Spanish fleet arrived, bringing the new Viceroy of New Spain along with it. The fleet was powerful, consisting of 2 warships and 11 armed merchantmen. In fear, Hawkins deployed a force to occupy the offshore island and erect batteries to defend his fleet, and he commanded his crews to prepare for action. His only hope was to stop the daunting enemy fleet from entering the harbour. The Spanish, also weakened from their long crossing, desperately needed safe harbour and risked being scattered by the high winds if they could not enter. Negotiations took place until an agreement was made and secured by the exchange of hostages. Coming to terms, the Spanish were allowed into their own port and the 2 fleets sat uncomfortably close, at point-blank range. It seemed the crisis had been averted, and both sides began to repair their ships, the crews in a state of wary camaraderie. The Spanish leaders, however, had no intention of honouring their agreement with heretics and pirates. Immediately, they planned their treachery. Soldiers were ordered in secret from Veracruz, and a few nights later smuggled aboard Spanish vessels. In the darkness, and without warning, the Spanish attacked, firing arquebuses and cannons into the English ships, focusing their fire on the Minion and trying to board it. In shock at the sudden attack, the English cut their lines and pulled their ships into the channel to get away, firing their cannons on the Spanish ships. The batteries on the island were seized by the Spanish soldiers and turned on the English ships. It was a brutal fight in the darkness, with cannons firing at point-blank range. The English concentrated their fire on the 2 Spanish warships, holding the flagship below the waterline and causing her to sink low in the water, her crew abandoning her to drift to the shore. The other Spanish warship was hit in the powder store and burst into flames, burning her to the waterline with a loss of 34 men. With the 2 warships out of action, the English turned to the huge merchantman, sinking one of them. But the shore batteries did their work, firing relentlessly into the small English ships, sinking one and battering the rest into submission before concentrating their fire into the ancient Jesus. It was doomed, and Hawkins ordered the transfer of all men, provisions and treasure into the Minion. Drake was in command of the Judith, a tiny and practically unarmed ship furthest away from the fighting. He brought her in to help unload men and supplies from the Jesus, which was ultimately captured. After a 6-hour battle, only the wounded Minion under Hawkins and Drake's overloaded Judith escaped. Both ships limped home. It took Drake 4 months. It was somewhat of a miracle that he made it at all. It was a disastrous end to a long and ambitious voyage. 200 or 300 Englishmen never saw their homeland again. Some fell into the hands of the Spanish Inquisition, and most died in prison or as slaves. Some were tortured and hanged or burned at the stake. This event altered the trajectory of Drake's life. Still a young man, he had been hoping to grow wealthy as a successful captain under Hawkins, trading between Africa, Brazil and the West Indies. But this event changed everything. For one thing, he somewhat fell out with Hawkins, who accused Drake of abandoning him after the battle, which tarnished what little reputation he had earned so far. And it's not known what effect taking part in the slaving had on Drake, but considering his actions towards Africans and Native Americans during the rest of his life, it's likely he found it at least distasteful and probably repellent. But most of all, the Spanish treachery and brutality lit a fire under Drake. For the rest of his life, he saw himself as a man on a personal quest of vengeance against the Spanish Empire. This, of course, was absurd. He was basically a nobody. He had no money, no prospects, and no fame. And yet, in the privacy of his own heart, Francis Drake declared war on Spain. Protestant England and Catholic Spain were already enemies, though not at war, and the battle at San Juan de Ulúa did little to change the trajectory that would bring them ever closer into outright conflict. Tiny, impoverished England could not hope to win against the might and wealth of Spain, and so Queen Elizabeth's policies prioritised avoiding war. When Drake was sent to court bearing letters explaining the outcome of the voyage, the Queen's advisors took no action. Returning to Devon, Drake set about planning his own reprisals. First, however, he had a more personal mission to complete. In July 1569, he married Mary Newman. She may have been from Cornwall or from London, but not too much else is known about her. She was probably an unsophisticated young woman from a humble background, a good enough match for a common sailor of dubious reputation. They were married for 12 years, but sadly they had no children. No doubt one or both were infertile, but the situation cannot have been helped by Drake's frequent and prolonged absences from their home. He was about 30 now, and in 1570 and 71 he made his first independent voyages into the West Indies. They were small-scale ventures, the first with 2 very small ships carrying probably 50 men at the most, and on the second he took just 1 ship. Here is when Drake made a permanent split from the English voyages of the previous decades. They had always included an element of piracy, to say the least, but their purpose had been trade. Drake, however, had no interest in that. His experience so far had shown that the Spanish and Portuguese were vulnerable at sea and in their poorly defended ports. Why bother attempting to force the Catholics to trade when you could just take what they had anyway? It also meant doing them damage, something they richly deserved not only for their popery, but for their treachery at San Juan de Ulúa. Small scale as it was, these voyages were a way to prove to potential future investors that Drake's ideas were profitable. While his first voyage was primarily a scouting mission, his second involved multiple acts of piracy off the Spanish Main, taking many vessels off the coast of Panama before returning home with merchandise worth perhaps 160,000 pesos or £66,000. Twice as much as the profits of the 3 Hawkins voyages put together. Drake had proved that his way was best, at least as long as he was the one in command. The local authorities had tried but failed to stop him. For the first time, but not the last, the King of Spain began to receive correspondence about the exploits of an English captain called Francis Drake. Inspired by Drake, other English captains immediately launched their own piratical voyages to the West Indies to plunder the ragged edges of Spain's wealthy empire. But Drake again had greater ambitions. Every year, the Spanish treasure fleet brought back a fortune in gold and silver mined from the New World. That fleet was powerful and well defended, unassailable in fact, but Drake had perceived a weakness. The treasure was brought up the Pacific coast over the course of the year, every year, and assembled in Panama before being loaded on pack mules and trekked across the Isthmus of Panama to the coastal town of Nombre de Dios. There it was stored until it could be loaded onto the fleet and shipped back to Spain. In 1572, Drake sailed with 2 small ships on his most daring and most risky venture yet. In the hours before dawn, on the 28th of July, he landed just 73 men on the shore and assaulted Nombre de Dios. Dividing into 2 groups, they attacked from 2 directions, with lit torches raised and drums sounding, marching into town as if they were a far greater force than they were. They meant to frighten the Spanish into submission before they realised that the Englishmen were terribly outnumbered. Still, the Spanish assembled and fired into the attackers, killing Drake's trumpeter and shooting Drake himself in the leg. The English returned fire and charged from both directions, breaking the Spanish. Now in charge of the town, Drake sent his men to capture as much treasure as they could before the Spanish realised they could defeat the outnumbered pirates with ease if they organised a counterattack. The English discovered a pile of silver bars so enormous that they did not have time to steal it all. While they searched for gold and jewels that they were sure were hidden in the town, Drake's wound finally caught up with him and he collapsed, unconscious. His distraught men, now leaderless, carried him back to the boats and fled for the ships. Frustrated, Drake attacked local shipping once more and blockaded Cartagena, but he was not strong enough to take such a large town. Instead, he devised another plan for the Spanish treasure. He would capture it before it ever reached the Caribbean coast, somewhere on the trackway through the jungles of the Isthmus of Panama. But the interior was completely unknown country. The route was a mystery, the land strange and hostile. But in the jungles of Panama, there were villages of escaped African slaves known as the Cimarrons. They too hated the Spanish. The attack on Nombre de Dios had provided Drake with an opportunity greater than any treasure he had taken so far. There was a black man named Diego, a slave of the Spanish who had joined the English in the heat of the battle and returned with Drake to his ship afterwards. Diego attached himself to Drake, becoming in time one of his crewmen, returning with him to England and even joining him on his later circumnavigation of the world. Diego assured Drake that the Cimarrons would be the allies that the Englishmen needed. As his men made contact and began negotiations, Drake prepared the area by leaving caches of supplies and trading with the local Indians, as well as capturing 6 or 7 enemy ships and seizing their provisions. The Cimarrons already knew of Drake from his attacks on the Spanish and were keen to make common cause with him against their joint enemy. This alliance was developed over the next few months, with the Cimarrons guiding Drake and his men through the jungles and coasts. Drake built a fort on an island and named it Fort Diego after his new friend. Sadly, they were struck by the yellow fever and an astonishing 40% of the company there died. Finally, word came from their allies that the treasure was on the move, and 18 Englishmen and 30 Cimarrons set off to intercept it. They marched for days, making camp in the jungle at night. They stopped off at a Cimarron town on a hillside, protected by a ditch and a mud bank. 4 days after, they reached a very high hill, and upon its summit was an enormous tree, into which the Cimarrons had cut steps into the trunk, so they could climb to the top, where they had built a viewing platform. Following the Cimarron leader up, Drake stood atop the platform and looked out to a sight few Englishmen had yet seen: the Pacific Ocean. One day he would be the first Englishman to sail it too, but not yet. Then they dug in to wait for the coming of the long mule train along the path. However, at the worst possible moment, a drunken English sailor spoiled the surprise, lurching into the path of a Spanish rider who charged on to sound the alarm. The mule train turned back to Panama, and Drake and his allies fled in failure. Instead of giving up, however, Drake simply bided his time and waited for the treasure train to come trekking through the jungle again. The next time they tried the ambush, it was far closer to the destination of Nombre de Dios, trusting that the guards and mule drivers would think themselves all but safe. And this time, the ambush worked. The Englishmen and the Cimarrons fell upon the mule convoy from all sides, seizing the first and last in the line and driving off the soldiers guarding it. They captured 200,000 pesos worth of treasure. There was so much that they could not even carry it all off the trail and into the jungle. Still, the gold was prioritized over the silver, and Drake and his men made their getaway. What couldn't be carried was hastily buried for later retrieval: 15 tons of silver. 100,000 pesos worth of treasure was stolen, about £40,000, which was perhaps a fifth of the annual revenues of the Queen of England. Spanish soldiers and ships in hot pursuit, Drake made his escape. Enormously grateful for his Cimarron allies, Drake rewarded their leaders with personal gifts from his own stores. Their leader, a man living in the jungles of Panama called Pedro, received a beautiful sword with a jewel-encrusted golden handle. Drake returned to England in triumph. He had stolen only 1/20th of the annual Spanish New World revenues, and yet he had utterly humiliated the Spanish. They had been unable to stop him at sea or on land, and they were greatly alarmed by Drake's alliance with the Cimarrons. Drake was now wealthy, and he was famous at home and infamous abroad. But he was only just getting started. In 1574, Drake became embroiled in Elizabeth's campaigns against the Irish. The English conquest of Ireland took many centuries to complete. It was motivated by many things through the generations, from booty and land for English colonies and plantations to glory and fame in war. In the 16th century and after, though, it also came to be about religion and international politics. Not only were the Irish heathen papists, but they could be exploited by Catholics abroad, even used by the Spanish as a base to invade England. Drake had no interest in impoverished Ireland, but his skills at sea were utilised in support of the Earl of Essex's campaign against the Lords of Tyrone and mercenary Scots. Drake, with a paltry fleet, transported and landed soldiers under John Norris at Rathlin Island, between Ireland and Scotland. After a brief siege and attempts to storm the small castle there, the Scottish leader surrendered. The terms were that he and his family would be saved. The English then murdered every other man, woman and child they could find on the island. Drake's way of making war had always been different. He never killed or tortured his prisoners, even Spanish ones. In fact, he had defended his Spanish prisoners from vengeful Cimarrons. In a time of brutality all around the world, Drake was a surprisingly humane soldier. His miserable duty in Ireland complete, Drake turned to grander and more glorious ventures once more. He wanted to lead an English voyage to the Pacific Ocean. The only known way there by sea was through the Strait of Magellan, named after the Portuguese navigator in the employ of Spain who first negotiated it in 1519 and 20. Magellan, of course, had catastrophically failed in his attempted circumnavigation, being slaughtered in the Philippines. Only one of his ships eventually limping home with a tiny skeleton crew on the verge of death. Later voyages through the Straits also suffered terrible losses from mutiny, shipwreck, disease, starvation, and conflict with the native people. Drake's ambition to sail to the Pacific was absurd and surely destined for disaster, but he was motivated by the great wealth that he could seize from the unsuspecting Spanish. If the West Indies had been unprepared for him, then the coasts of Chile up to Mexico would be wide open. Drake's proposal to the Queen was only accepted with some provisions. It was an expensive voyage, but a potentially lucrative one, and many great men of the realm contributed funding in the expectation of some return. Drake had proved his abilities, and yet he was still just a commoner, and so men of greater standing must accompany him. One such man was Thomas Doughty, a gentleman secretary to Christopher Hatton, one of the Queen's favourite courtiers. Drake and Doughty left England as friends, but would soon find themselves bitter enemies. The voyage was prepared in secret, its destination known only to a few. It was believed by most of the mariners recruited for it that they would be sailing to trade in Alexandria and Constantinople. In fact, the plan was to sail through the Straits of Magellan and up the coast of Chile to make contact with the natives and seek alliances and trade before returning home. He also had a secret commission to wage his private war on the Spanish. Drake built his flagship, the Pelican, specially for this voyage. It was built to be a fine sailor with an extremely sturdy hull, able to take a pounding in powerful foreign seas. With 18 cannons, she was fairly well armed, but was overall a rather small vessel of about 80 to 100 feet. The fleet was also made up of the Elizabeth, the Marigold, the Swan and the Benedict. All told, there were about 160 men and boys to sail them. On 11th of September 1577, Drake bid farewell to his wife Mary, neither knowing if they would ever see one another again, and the small fleet set off from Plymouth. Poor weather at first drove them back to port again, an inauspicious start, and after refitting they set off again, heading first down to the northwest coast of Africa. Sailing past the Mediterranean, it became clear to the crew that they were not in fact sailing to Alexandria after all. Perhaps the crew were unhappy to be so deceived, but the English fleet soon took half a dozen Spanish and Portuguese ships off the coast of Africa, and the nature of the voyage may have become clearer. The prospect of sharing booty would have placated most of the English mariners. They stopped for provisions in the Portuguese Cape Verde Islands, where Drake took yet another ship, which was renamed the Mary, perhaps after Drake's wife, which, if so, is a sweet indication of the affection he had for her. Drake appointed Thomas Doughty as her captain, but it seems that Doughty stole for himself some items from the prize. The crew complained of this, and Drake transferred Doughty to take charge of the flagship, the Pelican, while Drake took over the Mary to pacify her discontented crew. Instead of being grateful for this neat piece of leadership by Drake, Doughty at once began to work on the crew of the Pelican, trying to turn them against Drake by promising them wealth if they did Doughty's bidding instead. It was seditious behaviour bordering on mutiny. However, the leadership of the enterprise was perhaps not entirely clear. Drake was apparently in charge, and yet his second-in-command, Captain Winter, captain of the Elizabeth, was his social superior. Winter perhaps felt that Drake was not in command of him. And Thomas Doughty was certainly a gentleman who also seems to have seen himself as Drake's equal in the mission, if not his superior. Doughty perhaps felt that he represented Sir Christopher Hatton, who as a Queen's counsellor represented the will of the Queen. This lack of clarity and Doughty's mutinous activities would haunt the entire first leg of the mission, as the fleet crossed the Atlantic for 60 days out of sight of land before they made landfall on the coast of Brazil. From there they headed southwards along the coast until they found a sheltered harbour to refit and repair, killing seals for fresh meat and refilling water casks. They made contact with the local native peoples of the shore. Drake's method of making friends with them was to leave presents on rods stuck into the ground before retiring a safe distance. The locals could then approach safely to take the items and replace them with gifts of their own like meat, fruit and necklaces. These natives were a startling-looking lot to the Englishmen, with their long hair and red, white and black body paint, and the bones or wooden rods thrust through their noses or lips. But the two groups got on well for the duration, enjoying one another's music and company. At one point, a local snatched off Drake's scarlet cap and ran off in triumph with his prize. Instead of reprisals, Drake would suffer no man to hurt any of them. Throughout his life, Drake always sought good relations with the native peoples he met. Occasionally, as we shall see, his trust could come at a significant cost, but he seems to have enjoyed making friends with all those he encountered, seeking trade and fellowship rather than violence, much as he had with the Cimarrons. Of course, he would have had no doubt about the intellectual and material superiority of his own civilization and race, and more importantly, of the moral superiority of his Christianity over the primitive pagan beliefs he encountered. But he liked the native people he met around the world, just as he did the Cimarrons of Panama, especially those like Diego that he had retained as crewmen. One of Drake's men later told a Spaniard that, quote, "those Negroes were the brothers of Captain Francis, who loved them dearly," end quote. While a Spanish prisoner of Drake's said that, quote, he had heard Captain Francis say that he loved them, and every day he asked if they were in peace, end quote. Who he did not love, however, was Thomas Doughty, who still worked constantly to undermine Drake's authority. Drake transferred Thomas from vessel to vessel, trying but failing to find a way to bring him to heel. This could not continue, and when they reached the anchorage of Port St. Julian, Drake set about finding a more permanent solution. When they arrived, they found a grim remnant from Ferdinand Magellan's voyage 58 years earlier, a wooden gallows built on the shore where Magellan had hanged one of his men for mutiny. On arrival, Drake and 6 men rowed ashore to make contact with the local Indians. Drake, perhaps foolishly assuming all Indians would be as friendly as those he had met 1,000 miles to the north, let his guard down. At first, all seemed well, and the Englishmen made their usual attempts at friendship. A crewman showed off his longbow, which was incredibly powerful compared to the seemingly feeble ones held by the group of native men on the beach. But during the demonstration, the string of the longbow snapped, and one of the locals, apparently believing the foreigners were now unarmed and vulnerable, immediately shot the Englishman through his chest, fatally wounding him. Another one of Drake's men aimed his arquebus, but the powder was damp and it misfired. The Indian murdered him too, shooting him at close range through the chest. In a state of high excitement, the whole group now showered arrows down on the remaining 5 Englishmen. Drake ordered those of his men who had shields to form a defence until the Indians ran low on arrows, at which point Drake himself ran forward and snatched up the fallen arquebus, added dry gunpowder and turned it on the Indian who had killed his crewman. With a loud bang and fire and smoke, Drake blasted his guts abroad, causing the remaining Indians to flee. For the rest of the month the English used the anchorage, the Indians never bothered them again. But Drake still had to deal with a more serious problem. No English vessels had ever been so far south, and no English vessel had ever attempted the treacherous Straits of Magellan. If this voyage was to have any hope of even reaching the Pacific, Doughty would have to be dealt with once and for all. So Drake summoned every man in the squadron to assemble on land, and before them all, announced that he was putting Doughty on trial. Doughty challenged Drake's power to even do such a thing. What gave him, a mere commoner, the authority to try a gentleman? Drake claimed that his authority came directly from the Queen herself. However, he declined to present his supposed commission and ordered Doughty's arms be bound. A jury was sworn, with Captain Winter as its foreman, and charges of mutiny and treason were read, and evidence debated and challenged, before a guilty verdict was returned. The only matter now was to decide what to do with the guilty man. Drake would have preferred not to execute such a man, even if he was a mutineer, but putting him down in Peru for the Spaniards to capture was rejected, as was sending him back to England with Captain Winter, meaning the loss of a ship which would endanger the whole endeavour. With no other option, Doughty was sentenced to death, and the next day he was beheaded. Drake held up Doughty's head and cried, "Lo, this is the end of traitors." He hoped that this would draw a bloody line under the whole affair. Doughty might have been a properly educated man with many supporters in the crew, but he did not have Drake's personal magnetism and leadership qualities. The matter of who had ultimate authority over the expedition, Drake, Doughty or Winter, was ultimately decided not by law or tradition, but by the man who had the will to seize it. Before going on, Drake addressed the men to draw a line underneath it all and to tell them that they must now be united as one body of men under him, their leader. Quote, "Thus it is, my masters, that we are very far from our country and friends. We are compassed in on every side with our enemies, wherefore we are not to make small reckoning of a man, but we cannot have another man if we would give for him 10,000 pounds. Wherefore we must have these mutinies and discords that are grown amongst us redressed. I must have it left, for I must have the gentleman to haul and draw with the mariner, and the mariner with the gentleman. Let us show ourselves to be all of a company, and let us not give occasion to the enemy to rejoice at our decay and overthrow." End quote. They would now set off into the treacherous strait, and, God willing, the Pacific beyond. The riches of the Spanish Empire beckoned, and none of the crewmen on any of the ships had any doubt about who was in command. Before entering the Magellan Strait, Drake had his 3 remaining ships salute the Queen, held a religious service, and changed the name of his ship from the Pelican to the Golden Hind. This name was meant to honour one of the voyage's backers, Sir Christopher Hatton, whose family crest was a hind, a female deer. The recently executed Thomas Doughty had been Hatton's servant, and presumably the new name was a diplomatic gesture meant to appease the powerful gentleman back home when and if they returned to England. The strait was a complex and dangerous waterway, surrounded by towering peaks and dense woodlands. No one on board had been through these waters before, and the 300-mile passage had treacherous currents and winds, shoals and rocks below the surface, and a confusing mass of islands and dead ends with few safe anchorages. Nevertheless, they managed the journey in about 14 days, which is one of Drake's most notable feats of navigation and seamanship. On the other side, however, they met with a disaster that could well have ended the voyage once and for all. Indeed, it's something of a miracle that it did not. Heading north for Peru, a mighty storm drove the small fleet relentlessly southwards. This was a tempest greater than any of these lifelong sailors had ever experienced, and it lasted for weeks. They could not escape the black skies and mountainous white-capped waves, and fought constantly to avoid being dashed to pieces on the coastline. Every day, every hour was a constant battle for survival, and not all the ships or men were equal to the task. On one wild night, the Marigold was sunk, and some on the Golden Hind heard the fearful cries of the sailors as they were driven under by the raging seas. Captain Winter, on the other hand, gave up the voyage. Separated from the Golden Hind, Winter's ship, the Elizabeth, found a haven within the Strait of Magellan and spent weeks refitting and recovering from the ordeal. When they were able to sail once more, instead of searching for Drake and the Golden Hind, they instead headed back to England, which was no small feat in itself, and 9 men were killed on the way home. The Golden Hind, meanwhile, now the sole English vessel in the Pacific, was driven on ever southwards and eastwards, seeking to stay ahead of the storm while looking for safe harbours amongst the confusing and dangerous mass of islands and inlets of Tierra del Fuego. They went so far south and east, in fact, that they discovered something that no one had known before. The Magellan Strait was believed to be the only way between the American continent and the hypothetical southern continent, Terra Australis. Instead, they realised for the first time that beyond the chain of islands of Tierra del Fuego lay nothing but open sea. This treacherous stretch of water with its monstrous waves is still known today as the Drake Passage. They landed at what they believed to be the southernmost island, which may have been Cape Horn, and Drake claimed the group of islands for England, naming them the Elizabeth Islands, erecting a stone with the Queen's name and the date. And Drake also went ashore. Now this may be a relatively insignificant event in Drake's life, in comparison to all the many great things he achieved, but it's also a moment that to me conveys the man's character better than any other. He made his way on foot to the most southerly point of the last island, and advanced alone to the edge of the wind-battered sea cliff, with the vast waves smashing far below into the black rocks. And there he lay full length upon the ground, looking out for a time at the endless sea and sky beyond. Eventually he rose and returned to his men, where he declared that he, Francis Drake, had been further south than any European in the world before him. Now it was time to head north again, with a fair wind finally, to Chile, and here is where Drake almost met with disaster again at the hands of native people on the island of Mocha. After making contact, the wary English traded for sheep, hens and maize before going back to the ship. After this initial friendly meeting, they let their guard down, and the next day they rowed a boat into a creek to collect fresh water. The local Indians of that region had been fighting a guerrilla war against the Spanish for years, and made little distinction between their enemy and these new intruders. Drake and his handful of foolishly unarmed men were ambushed, just as their boat grounded on the riverbank. A huge number of warriors rose out of the banks of reeds, shooting at the Englishmen with arrows and darts. The English retreated as fast as they were able, beating back the men who waded through the river to get at them. 2 of the English crew who had stepped out to moor the boat were dragged away to be murdered, and every other man was wounded, Drake himself receiving 2 to the head, including an arrow that struck him below the right eye. Once back aboard the Hind, the crew begged for the ship's cannons to be turned on the natives who were busy butchering the 2 men left behind. They wanted to take their revenge and kill as many of the Indians as possible. Drake, whose affection for and trust in native peoples generally had cost another 2 of his men their lives, refused. He believed the Indians had suffered enough under the Spanish and wanted to give the English a better record. So instead he sailed on to make war on his real enemies. He struck north along the long coasts of Chile and Peru in an astonishing piratical raid that lasted months, taking ships and settlements as he went, always staying ahead of the news of his arrival. No one had any idea that an English ship was in these waters until it was already bearing down on them or sailing into their harbour. The Spanish vessels were used to sailing up and down this coast between distant ports, exchanging supplies and bullion, requiring only enough firepower to defend against the native people. When the Golden Hind chased them down one after the other, firing warning shots, and the crew brandishing their weapons, the Spanish ships might return fire and resist as best they could, but they all eventually surrendered, one after the other. This might seem cowardly and ignoble behaviour by the Spanish, but really, added to the shock of an English vessel appearing from nowhere, each ship alone was outgunned and outmatched. Drake's capable crew were drilled to perfection and led brilliantly by a captain they loved and respected. The prizes they took were carefully recorded and tallied, and every man knew he would in time receive his fair share. The Spanish prisoners were treated with the utmost respect by Drake, who invariably invited captured captains to dine with him in his cabin, where they would converse and enjoy music. The victims of his piracy also reported being given parting gifts by Drake, in the form of cash, cloth, tools and fine clothing, and even weapons and silver. Incidentally, Drake also greatly enjoyed painting, in between plucking Spanish vessels out of the sea and helping himself to their cargo. He recorded all the geography and navigational information in his logs, and he also carefully painted the fascinating local wildlife he saw, the birds, trees and sea life. All this precious and perhaps beautiful secret information was on his return handed over to the Queen, where it was locked away and has never been seen since. From ships and ports, Drake took chests packed with coins, silver and gold bars, jewellery and silver plate, barrels of wine, sacks of flour and other goods and merchandise. The English plucked up fishing boats and merchant vessels transporting silver from the mines up towards Panama. But the greatest single prize was the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, which the Spanish nicknamed the Cacafuego. Hearing this great treasure-laden ship was ahead of him, Drake did all he could to chase it down before it reached its destination. Upon taking it, the English counted 14 chests of silver reals, 80 pounds of gold, and 26 tons of silver bars. The value of the registered cargo alone, and there was unregistered bullion too, was perhaps half the annual revenue of the English crown. Drake lost crewmen to Spanish resistance, and yet Drake's great pirate raid up the Spanish coast from Chile to Peru to Mexico, taking ship after ship, was astonishingly bloodless for the Spaniards. They were beaten down in boarding actions, and the English roughed up defiant prisoners who refused to give up the information they wanted. But the Englishmen did not kill a single Spaniard. To my mind, this is perhaps the most incredible part of the whole tale. In all those many moments of conflict, with dozens of Spanish ships and the hundreds of Spaniards attacked and taken prisoner, despite their religious disagreements, despite Drake's anger over the treachery at San Juan de Ulúa and his desire for vengeance against Spain, no man was killed, not even by accident, not even in moments of high tension when prisoners and ships were taken, searched and released. The discipline of Drake's crew, the discipline that he instilled in them, was extraordinary. But their time of attacking Spanish shipping was over. They needed somewhere to lay up, out of reach of Spanish reprisals, to repair and refit the ship and to lay in stores for the return journey. The entire coast they had passed was too risky, and so they went on north, beyond Spain's reach, while Drake considered his options. The most obvious plan now was to head back the way they had come, but that risked being caught by the now wary and prepared enemy. A journey across the Pacific, circumnavigating the world to get home must have excited him, but no one had done it successfully before. Magellan's fleet had been so savaged by the journey that only one vessel and a handful of surviving crew made it home in a terrible condition. The other option was to locate and traverse the fabled Northwest Passage, which everyone agreed must exist, even if no one had found it yet. They advanced northward along the west coast of America, probably as far as Vancouver Island, further north in that part of the world than any European before them. But they were met by appallingly cold weather, freezing rain that iced up the rigging, making it impossible to sail on. Anyway, rather than the expected route eastwards to the Atlantic, the land instead continued northwest, and so Drake retreated south once more. They found an ideal spot to lay up in what's now Northern California, north of San Francisco. Rather than sheltering somewhere in that vast bay, they likely laid up on the broad beaches of what's called Drake's Bay today, where the white cliffs reminded the English of the south coast of their homeland. The climate too was like home, and all this together drove Drake to name this land Nova Albion, a New England in the New World. Here they set up tents, built a fort, established a forge and unloaded the ship and set about making repairs. The local people were the coastal Miwok, and they and the Englishmen got on very well throughout their stay. They were, according to one account, a people of tractable, free and loving nature without guile or treachery. More and more locals came every day to look upon these strange visitors, trying to make sense of who they were and what their appearance meant. Gifts were exchanged by both sides. Eventually, a local chief arrived with a great procession of his warriors and envoys, and Drake was presented with a scepter and a crown and chains of clamshells. There was an impenetrable cultural barrier, of course, and the English conveniently believed the Miwok had declared Drake a king, inviting him to rule over these lands. So accepting, Drake claimed it all for England and his queen, setting up a post with a plate bearing his name and the date. But no attempt to rule was made. For now at least, the English felt free to wander inland through the lush woodlands and visit the Miwok villages, exchanging gifts and friendship for a month or so until the repairs were made and the ship was ready for another dangerous voyage. Because Drake had decided to risk it. He would take his ship and crew west again, across the vast Pacific to the Spanish East Indies. From there he would have to sail through the Moluccas and across the Indian Ocean to Africa, then around the Cape and all the way up the Atlantic to England. It would be a vast and mostly unknown journey. Drake had some accounts of Spanish voyages and some written sailing instructions, but these were vague and often wrong. It must have been unbelievably daunting, sailing into the unknown. Saying farewell to the Miwok, who waved from the hills above the bay, the Golden Hind set out for what we know today as the Philippines. They sailed day after day across the Pacific, trusting that they would find land before they ran out of food and water. They sailed for 68 days out of sight of land, before they saw a small island in the distance. It might have been Palau, but no one knows for sure. When anchored offshore, the locals rowed out in dugout canoes, and the English hoped for another useful exchange of gifts and trade. However, the Micronesians acted very rudely and began stealing the crew's possessions and squabbling over their prizes. The English decided that they had had enough and tried to get rid of them, but the locals gradually turned violent, and the visitors found themselves under a bombardment of stones and darts launched from the surrounding canoes. Even firing a cannon only briefly scared them away, and reluctantly Drake ordered that the gun be turned on the tribesmen themselves. The English artillery blew apart 1 or 2 canoes and perhaps 20 people. Finally, the locals departed in fear, and soon the English left too. Drake was not proud of this incident, to say the least, but their feelings towards the locals were clear by the name they applied to this place, calling it the Island of Thieves. After this, they reached Mindanao, in what would come to be called the Philippines. From there, they went south to the Moluccas, the fabled Spice Islands, where the Portuguese had been trading now for decades. These were dangerous, unknown seas, and the political situation was potentially an even greater risk. The Golden Hind was laden with treasure taken from the Spanish, and all Drake and his men wanted was to get home safely. But first they had to navigate through waters ruled by local sultans. Drake exchanged gifts and emissaries with the Sultan of Ternate, and even negotiated a promise of aid from Queen Elizabeth in exchange for a piece of the spice trade. Eventually, the Hind set off again, even more loaded down, this time with 6 tons of valuable cloves, and headed through the Makassar Strait. Here, though, was another near catastrophe that could have ended the voyage once and for all. The heavily laden Hind sailed carefully through the unknown waters, with mariners always on watch looking for hidden shoals and reefs that could destroy the ship. But one night, while under full sail with what appeared to be nothing but open water ahead, the Hind drove herself with terrible force up onto a hidden rock a few feet beneath the surface. The Hind was stuck fast and heeling over. Though the exhausted crew toiled for hours and hours, it seemed that all was lost, and plans were made to abandon ship. The cargo of cloves and other victuals were thrown overboard. Even ammunition, powder, and cannons themselves were launched over the side to lighten the ship. Not the gold, though. Throughout the crisis, Drake remained calm and determined in command, and directed the men in their work and their prayer until, thanks be to God, the Hind was lifted by tides and currents and changing winds from the hidden reef. Sailing on to the south coast of Java, they once again restocked and refitted for the crossing of the Indian Ocean, which they completed in about 2 months. Rounding the Cape of Good Hope, about a month after that, they sailed up to Sierra Leone, where they made landfall again in somewhat familiar waters. It had been almost 10,000 miles of sailing from Java to Sierra Leone without a friendly base or reliable map, and it's again another breathtaking example of navigation and seamanship. It was another 3 months before the Golden Hind sailed up the English Channel, freshly painted and trailing colourful pennants. On the 26th of September 1580, sailing into Plymouth Sound, a man on board hailed a nearby fishing boat and called out a strange question. Was Queen Elizabeth still alive? They had been away for 3 long years, but now Francis Drake, along with a staggering fortune, was finally home. Drake did not come home to a hero's welcome. News of his exploits in the Pacific had preceded his arrival. The victims of his piracy sent outraged complaints home to Spain, where the stolen goods were tallied and restitution sought from the English crown. At first, Queen Elizabeth was publicly cool towards Drake, as she wanted above all to avoid provoking Spain into a war that England could never win. Drake sent envoys to London and wrote to the backers of his voyage, as the truly vast return on their investment was a powerful bargaining chip. It's not known exactly how much treasure Drake returned with, because Drake kept an unknown portion for himself. Half belonged to the Queen, and the remainder of the treasure was not officially registered, but one estimate is that it came to £1.5 million. Soon enough, Drake was invited to London, where tons of the treasure were lodged in the Tower, and he gifted more to the Queen personally. The details of his great voyage were a state secret, and he was invited to relate it all to Elizabeth in private over many hours. What an incredible honour that must have been for the Devonshire yeoman, and what a story he must have told her. In April 1581, about 7 months after his return, Drake was knighted on the deck of the Golden Hind in London. Elizabeth dined on board. Drake recounted the details of the voyage while giving her a tour of the famous ship, and then the Queen asked a French envoy to knight Drake. This was a deft piece of diplomacy, where she simultaneously deflected Spanish ire against her while honouring her French allies. The kneeling Devonshire yeoman, thanks to his ambition, daring and ability, arose a Knight of England. Drake had turned himself into one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom and one of the most famous men in Christendom. Now he was a knight, and over the next few years he dedicated himself to becoming a proper gentleman, investing some of his vast fortune in a suitable country estate, Buckland Abbey, and becoming Mayor of Plymouth and a Member of Parliament. All he needed now to cement his place in English society was an heir. However, his wife Mary died in January 1583. In 1585, Drake married a young woman named Elizabeth Sydenham, but sadly she too would never bear him a child. He was in his 40s now, and he had won fame and fortune, and a life of comfortable retirement beckoned. However, Drake the adventurer was not at ease on land. At sea, Drake was utterly in command of his ship and his men. He could ride out any storm and take his vessel wherever he willed. He creatively sought opportunities for victory and could turn adversity on its head. No one and nothing could stand against his endless energy and sheer ability. On land, however, he never achieved very much, either as mayor or member of parliament or as a courtier. His manners were unrefined compared to men of better breeding, while they were jealous of his fame and wealth. Perhaps he found it all too stifling. He was too hemmed in and controlled for his liking. At sea, on the other hand, he was his own master, free to go where he wanted, to do as he willed. Out there, he had loyal men willing to die for him. Out there was adventure and endless possibilities. "It isn't that life ashore is distasteful to me," Drake famously said, "but life at sea is better." Over these years, England and Spain were moving ever closer to outright war. An alliance of Catholic forces on the continent motivated England to support Protestants in the Low Countries with money and military forces. Philip II resolved to bring his full power to bear against the Protestant English and the heretic Queen, who oppressed Catholics in her realm and supported Spain's enemies abroad. In 1585, Philip issued an order to seize English shipping in Spanish ports, and merchant vessels were impounded, their arms, munitions and equipment stripped for use by Spain, and crewmen imprisoned. Fortunately, the Queen had the perfect man for the job of striking back, and Drake was for the first time given an official commission, authorising him to free English ships and crew and recoup the losses English merchants and shipowners had suffered. He was in effect given free rein to do what he did best. His powerful fleet was composed of 21 ships, 5 of them captained by men who had sailed with him on the Circumnavigation. They carried about 2,000 soldiers who were to impose a terrible retribution on the enemy. This was Drake's first command of a large force, and he had to manage not only his own crew, but its many lieutenants. They first sailed to Vigo in Spain, where they threatened the town with attack in exchange for what the expedition really needed: supplies. This was a bold and unexpected move that humiliated Spain on their home soil, but before the Spanish could respond, he was gone again. Not knowing where he would strike next, they prepared their defences, but Drake intended to use all his strength where Spain was weakest. First he sailed for the Canary Islands, decided against an attack on them, and sailed on to the Cape Verde Islands. Here he assaulted the island of Santiago, landing 1,000 men, taking cannons, ammunition and supplies, evacuating the population of the small towns, and burning their settlements behind them. Now they crossed the Atlantic for the West Indies, but during the voyage the fleet was struck down by a terrible disease that killed hundreds of men. Nevertheless, there was no force in the West Indies capable of stopping the English fleet. First, Drake sacked the port of Santo Domingo on Hispaniola. It was the oldest Spanish city in the New World, once the capital of Spain's colonial empire, and was still a significant settlement. Heavily fortified and defended by over 3,000 militia, this force was apparently poorly equipped and led, and had terrible morale. The English meanwhile landed soldiers in the dark of the night to advance on the city from the landward side, while when the sun rose the defenders found an English fleet sailing toward the harbour. While the ships opened fire, the English soldiers assaulted the gates and poured into the town. It was swiftly plundered from basements to belfries, and Drake, using the looted cathedral as his headquarters, exacted a ransom of 25,000 ducats from the local governor in exchange for leaving. By the time the English left, a third of the houses, all the churches and religious buildings, the castle and the ships were destroyed, and thousands of slaves had been freed. The Spanish had been dealt a severe blow, but Drake was not done. Next, he directed his fleet to the Spanish Main, where his forces clashed with a well-prepared force defending the city of Cartagena in what's now Colombia. Again, the English soldiers advanced by land and stormed the defences to take the city. Once in command of the place, Drake freed the enslaved French, Turks and Africans he found within, many of them choosing to join his forces. Once again, he forced the survivors to pay a ransom to get their city back, slowly burning parts of it to encourage them to pay up. Eventually, the English raised 113,000 ducats for the city, plus more from wealthy private individuals who paid to save their houses and ships. Yet again, Spain had been humiliated. They seemed utterly unable to resist whatever Drake wanted to do to them. Drake, though, was powerless against the disease, which ripped through his fleet, and he found his strength so depleted he could not attack Panama or Havana as he had intended. Instead, it was time to return home. Resupplying at Cuba and digging water wells, we get another snapshot of Drake's leadership style, where he was described as mucking in with the common crew. He, quote, helped to load and went into the water to his armpits, fully clothed and shod, carrying barrels and demijohns of water, end quote. He had one final mission to complete, which was to visit the new English colony in North America at Roanoke Island, off what's now North Carolina. On the way, he passed the Spanish fort and town at St. Augustine in Florida and realised the forces there could threaten the English colony, and so, to be on the safe side, he attacked and burned both fort and town to the ground, as well as their orchards and fields. There was a nearby Indian village that, true to form, he left alone, even though the warriors came out to defend the Spanish and killed one of the Englishmen. After finding the colony at Roanoke, Drake collected the colonists who had had quite enough of America and returned with them to England. Financially, the expedition was not a success, and disease had cost them dearly in lost men. But as an act of war, it had bloodied Spain's nose, hurt them financially, and gave heart to the embattled Protestants of Europe. King Philip, however, was resolved to respond decisively. For the sake of the Empire and for God, England would have to be conquered once and for all. A mighty fleet was prepared in the ports of Spain and Portugal. It was a massive undertaking, costing a vast sum and requiring stores and men from all over Europe and beyond, and the dockyards of Iberia rang to the sounds of preparation. The English knew it was coming, and they too hurried to construct and equip ships of their own. It was a race against time, and the English did not have the resources to match their powerful enemy. Francis Drake and other hawkish courtiers begged the Queen to authorise a preemptive strike against Spain, to at the very least delay their attack and to give the English a ghost of a chance. It made a certain sense, but it was a terrible risk. The money, ships and men needed for such a venture might all be lost for no gain, leaving England even weaker than she was already. After months of pressure, the Queen relented, and after swift and secret preparations, Drake sailed with all possible haste with a fleet of 27 ships for Spain in April 1587. On the way, they heard that the Spanish were assembling a huge fleet in the port of Cadiz, intending to then sail it to Lisbon and from there to England. Drake knew from a lifetime of raiding Spanish possessions that above all, surprise and decisiveness of action were the keys to victory. And so he rushed as quickly as possible towards southern Spain. Cadiz was one of the most important ports of Europe and was the focal point of Spain's maritime power. It was so venerable that to attack it without warning was unthinkable. So much so that when Drake's sails appeared on the horizon on the evening of the 29th of April, no one in Cadiz imagined that they could belong to an enemy. In fact, Drake had pushed his small fleet so hard that the ships were rather strung out behind him. Putting surprise above all else, he did not wait for them, nor did he spend time reconnoitring the port and its defences, nor did he spend much time on a council of war with the captains he did have available. His plan, if you could call it that, was to sail straight in on the tide and to attack, take or burn whatever targets presented themselves. The most astonishing thing about all this is that it actually worked. The fortresses and gun batteries protecting the harbour were largely unmanned, and most of the 60 or so ships in the Great Harbour were unarmed. Some were provisioned and destined for the Armada, others were merchantmen simply loading or unloading cargo. But they were all easy targets for the incoming English ships. The crews armed and keen for battle, the cannonballs and powder ready by the guns. An eyewitness described the scene as Drake's ships sailed casually through the harbour entrance. Quote, "The nonchalance that there was so great, and the confidence that no enemy would dare to enter the bay, nor had it been heard in many centuries previous of any having such daring to break through the gates and entrances of their port." End quote. A pair of the famed Spanish war galleys, specialists at war in the Mediterranean, soon rowed out to investigate the strange newcomers, and were swiftly sent into retreat when Drake opened fire on them, killing several oarsmen. More galleys were rowed out, but they were no match for Drake's ship, and they fled. The soldiers, sailors, and population of Cadiz realised finally that they were under attack, and panic swiftly spread through the harbour and city. Some ships in the outer harbour tried to flee for the safety of the river mouths or into the inner port. Some ships, including a vast Genoese vessel of 30 or 40 guns, came out to fight. Soldiers were assembled in the town to counter any English landing of troops and to restore order. 26 Spaniards were trampled underfoot by panicking townsfolk fleeing for the castle. As night fell, the English ships kept up their continuous fire while their crews launched boats to capture or burn the Spanish ships at anchor. Ships great and small were set ablaze, and towering flames lit up the night as the English did their well-practiced work. The attack continued all through the next day, and between 30 and 40 ships were captured or destroyed by the time Drake called off his men and sailed away. The greatest power in Christendom had been shown vulnerable not only in the New World, but in their homeland. Vulnerable at least to the English sea dogs and the apparently unstoppable Francis Drake. Drake, however, was still not satisfied with this incredible victory. Instead of taking his fleet and sailing for home in triumph, he looked around for what further trouble he could cause to the Armada. He established a base near Cape St. Vincent, from where he could attack Spanish and Portuguese shipping along the coast. There were castles and forts protecting this important location, of course, and Drake led landing parties to take these by force. While by sea, his men scoured the bays and ports nearby, destroying every vessel they could find. They destroyed 50 or 60 fishing boats and their nets to deprive the Armada of food, plus 47 caravels and barks laden with iron hoops and wooden planks, which were all burned. Destroying tons of timber meant for making barrels and casks did perhaps more damage to the Spanish Armada than the attack on Cadiz or the subsequent battles in the English Channel. Drake also blockaded Lisbon, daring the assembling Armada within the port to come out and engage him in battle. However, the brilliant and experienced Spanish admiral in command, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, wisely declined to pit his unprepared forces against Drake. The English were unchallenged, disrupting and destroying at will, but a fleet cannot stay at sea forever, and so they had to return home. In typical Drake fashion, however, he could not resist sailing quite suddenly for the Azores, where he took an enormous Portuguese carrack, the king's own ship in fact, returning laden with treasure and spices from the East Indies. How he had timed it so perfectly, no one knew. It's no wonder that so many said Drake used black magic or was in league with the devil. How else to explain his uncanny, almost superhuman ability to find and take the greatest of prizes? As well as making a huge profit, the expedition had been staggeringly successful with this so-called singeing of the King of Spain's beard, setting back the assault on England by an entire year, giving England precious time to build and equip more ships. However, it was only delayed and could not be stopped. The Spanish Armada continued to be assembled into mighty squadrons, powerful enough to defeat any English force at sea, and, in the summer of 1588, it set sail for England. Francis Drake had risen as high as a commoner could ever hope, and he had proved himself the most capable captain that England and the Queen could call upon. However, he would not be given command of England's defensive fleet. The Lord High Admiral in command of all English forces at sea was Lord Howard of Effingham, a capable man of impeccable birth. Lord Howard, however, appointed Drake as one of his vice-admirals, serving under him and in command of one of the English fleet's squadrons. The English faced a daunting Spanish force. The Armada was made up of 73 warships, with more than 50 support vessels, carrying over 2,000 guns and 30,000 men. The Armada was to sail up the English Channel, avoiding any kind of engagement if possible, and to hold the narrow crossing between Flanders and Kent, while 20,000 soldiers from the Spanish Netherlands were ferried across. If that crossing was successful, then England had no hope of resisting. All agreed on the point that it would be won or lost at sea. In fact, at this stage in history though, no one really knew how to fight fleet engagements with these modern warships in open seas. The English were confident that their ships, smaller and lacking the traditional fore and after castles, were faster and better sailed, and that their well-manned long guns would rip the massive Spanish ships to pieces from a distance. The Spanish, on the other hand, intended to get close to the English with their larger, taller ships, and pound them with their shorter-barreled cannons before seeking to grapple and board the English vessels. Spanish warships carried soldiers in addition to the crew to do that fighting, while the English mariners had to sail, fire the guns, and fight boarding actions too. It's one of the most famous stories in British history that when word reached Plymouth that the Armada had been sighted, the commanders of the English fleet were quietly playing a game of bowls on Plymouth Hoe. This was the news that they and all England had been waiting for, dreading perhaps, for months and even years. There would have been terrible excitement, maybe an edge of panic, and yet Francis Drake was the picture of calm. "There is plenty of time to finish the game and beat the Spaniards too," he said, and continued with his bowling. Now, this story may not be true, but it is famous largely because of how well it portrays Drake's character. He was indeed calm in the face of danger. He did carry himself with a kind of swaggering arrogance and was so charismatic that as a natural-born leader, other men looked to him, especially in times of crisis, for how to behave themselves. Even if he never really said it, it was the sort of thing that he would have said. The Armada sailed along the English Channel in a formation 2 miles wide. The watching Englishmen lining the south coast had never seen anything like this in their lives. Instead of attacking the English fleet in Plymouth though, the Armada sailed on towards its destination. Over the next few days, the English squadron sailed out in pursuit and kept beyond grappling range while firing relentlessly at the Spanish ships, trying to cause damage without being caught themselves. While the English ships were too manoeuvrable for the Spanish to catch them, the English gunfire was also largely ineffective at ranges beyond 100 yards. In the night after their second prolonged engagement, Drake once more showed his brilliance, his creativity, and his lack of discipline. He was given the honour and responsibility of leading the English fleet through the night by way of his stern lantern, mounted at the rear of his ship Revenge. This was a critical role, as without the guiding light, the fleet would lose cohesion and isolated ships would be vulnerable at sunrise. It was an astonishing act then for Drake to extinguish this lantern and vanish into the night. In typical Drake fashion, he had somehow supernaturally smelled gold in the air. One of the huge Spanish ships had got into trouble the day before, colliding with other ships and losing its bowsprit and rudder. At dawn, Drake swooped down on it and boarded the vessel, which surrendered and was sent into port as a prize. It was carrying much needed gunpowder and an incredible 50,000 gold ducats. Drake had no personal need for further fortune, and yet he had risked the fleet and, by extension, England for the sake of a prize. And in fact, dawn had found the English fleet in disorder, with the flagship and some others without support and within gun range of the enemy. Fortunately, they escaped without harm. For some reason, perhaps because of the prize he had won, Drake was not reprimanded by the admiral. The battles along the channel continued with frantic manoeuvring for position and massive amounts of gunpowder spent, but although there was plenty of damage and death, with no ships on either side sunk by enemy fire. The Armada continued on its mission to meet up with the army and anchored at Calais in a densely packed defensive formation. The English held a council of war. It was now or never. If they did not engage fully, they might find England invaded while the fleet peppered the Armada from afar. To break up the enemy formation, they launched fire ships in the night. A well-established tactic, it was nevertheless difficult to get right, but the English mariners performed it perfectly. As the burning ships, lighting up the night, sailed relentlessly into the Spanish formation, occasionally firing off loaded guns grown red hot from the flames, the disciplined Spanish responded without panic. Nevertheless, they had to move or be destroyed, and there were a series of accidents and groundings as the fleet dispersed. At sunrise, the English squadrons rushed in to engage the enemy, and the furious Battle of Gravelines was fought. The English ships sailed back and forth, blasting the Spanish vessels from close range, while avoiding Spanish attempts to board them. Many Spanish ships were destroyed or severely damaged, and hundreds of Spaniards were killed and wounded. The English only withdrew when they ran out of ammunition. The next day, the English continued the pursuit, while the remnants of the battered Armada fled before the wind into the North Sea. They continued to see them out of English waters, turning back only once the Spanish were off Scotland. The Armada continued north before swinging around into the Atlantic, passing Ireland and returning to northern Spain. Many ships were lost, and men starved and died of thirst on the way home. The English victory was complete, and Drake was one of the heroes of England. Again, he could well have retired now at the height of his success, and with hindsight, perhaps he should have done. But he was not interested in retirement and wanted to punish Spain even further. Sadly, it would all be downhill for Drake from now on. What awaited him was failure, growing insignificance, and death. The year after the Armada, 1589, the English sought to follow up their victory by taking the fight once more to Spain. An expedition was launched under the joint command of Drake and the experienced soldier Sir John Norris. The plan was to destroy the remnants of the Armada in northern Spain, then to take Lisbon and encourage a revolt by the Portuguese against the Spanish King Philip, and then to conquer the Azores for England. It was an overly ambitious plan. Perhaps their recent successes had blinded them to what was possible, but also they were hampered by poor funding and delays in planning that left them short of men. Drake also made the poor decision to first take Coruña, a small town that he perhaps hoped to loot and make into a base for his fleet. However, they completely underestimated the defences and the spirited, well-led townsfolk, and after 2 weeks retreated in defeat. The failure cost men, time and morale. The English army later marched on Lisbon while Drake led the fleet by sea. However, the expected Portuguese rebellion against Spain did not materialise, and the exhausted, diseased English forces had to retreat to the ships under a Spanish counterattack. Drake wanted to sail to the Azores, but the weather was against him, and instead he attacked, looted and burned the town of Vigo to the ground before returning to England. The expedition had been a disaster. Thousands of men had been killed or lost to disease, and Drake's deft touch, his ability to make no wrong decisions, had seemingly deserted him. He was about 50 years old now. Perhaps his long years at sea and many battles had taken their toll on his body and mind. His vigour and energy, the quickness of wit and shrewd judgment of his youth finally fading. This catastrophe and his part in it, his poor decisions that cost the lives of thousands, left him out of favour for some time. 6 long years he stayed in England, but he was not idle, managing his estates and businesses, serving as a Member of Parliament and Deputy Lord Lieutenant, working as a military and civil engineer, and as a magistrate and prize commissioner. Just being a proper English gentleman and looking after Devon and Plymouth and seeing to the interests of the mariners of England. In his personal life, his wife accompanied him in his many social engagements, but sadly no pregnancy was forthcoming, and Drake began to think of his legacy. His fortune would have to go to his brothers and nephews. Again, permanent retirement from action would have been the logical choice, but he could not resist the lure of the sea and battle. He was a buccaneer at heart, a pirate through and through, a man who sought adventure and violence, revenge and the acquisition of treasure, even after a lifetime of it. The war against Spain dragged on, and though Iberia was too tough to crack, their empire still seemed most vulnerable in the West Indies. And so in 1595, the Queen commanded another expedition be made to ravage them there, disrupting the flow of treasure back to the homeland. The fleet was well equipped with 27 fine ships and 2,500 men, led by Drake and his old comrade and former patron, John Hawkins. The joint command was a problem. Both men were very different, and all such ventures should have a single leader at the top. What's more, Drake was in his mid-50s and Hawkins was in his 60s, both men well past their best years. Worst of all, however, was that the methods they had employed as younger men would no longer work in the modern world. In the long years since their last raids in the West Indies, the Spanish had invested in upgrading their defences, from building larger forts and higher walls to adding cannons and well-drilled soldiers and militia. They would not be surprised by pirate raids and sudden assaults again. And in this particular case, they in fact knew very well that Drake was coming. Due to endless interference from the Queen and her advisors, the expedition had faced repeated delays, and Spain's spy network had passed word of its coming to the Caribbean. As a young man, Drake had appeared out of nowhere again and again, from the West Indies to the Pacific to Spain itself, always a step ahead of his old enemy. Now, they knew he was coming, and they would be ready. The fleet sailed ponderously, taking longer than it should have done to cross the Atlantic. And then Sir John Hawkins, Drake's old comrade, fell ill and died near Puerto Rico. Hawkins had been a kinsman, a patron, and a man who had inspired him and given him his first command. Drake was now firmly in command of this expedition, but the death of this man was a mighty personal blow. After the funeral, Drake tried and failed to take the well-defended city of San Juan on Puerto Rico. The ultimate goal was to take the Isthmus of Panama and all the treasure it held. In earlier years, if he'd had this kind of force with him, he would have done it immediately and been successful. For some reason, however, he first sailed to what's now Colombia to take, loot and burn the settlements there. Rio de la Hacha and Santa Marta fell to the English, but by this time the crew and soldiers were much reduced by disease, and he decided against the tougher target of Cartagena. and all this raiding had really done was to warn Panama that Drake was almost at their door. Drake finally sailed to Nombre de Dios, a port that he had taken by surprise and gumption 23 years earlier with just a handful of plucky Devonshire mariners. Now he marched in with a far more powerful force, but the town was abandoned and the defenders fled. There was no loot to be had, but the English, led by Sir Thomas Baskerville, meant to march now with 800 men across the isthmus to Panama. Once taken, Drake would lead reinforcements by boat via the River Chagres. Instead, about 30 miles inland, the English soldiers met a hastily built Spanish fort on a hill, blocking the way. For some reason, they assaulted this head-on for hours, and the English were shot to pieces. Eventually, they retreated to the coast in failure and boarded the ships. They sought to recover at an island 100 miles away, but it was a sickly place, and many diseased Englishmen were buried there. Drake too would fall ill. He spent his final days in a state of depression, realizing that not only had he failed again, he had lived beyond his time. The world was not the same now, he insisted, as he tried to find a plan to save the expedition. Perhaps he would rush back to try again for Panama, taking them by surprise at last. But as they relocated again to Portobello, the sickness afflicting so many spread further and claimed more victims. Soon it became clear that Drake, lying in his cabin suffering from dysentery, would not recover. He dictated a will before he became delirious. His final act was to rise from his bed to demand that he be dressed in his armour and so to die as a soldier. An hour later, shortly before the tropical sunrise, he finally passed away. His men held a sombre service and buried him at sea, and the fleet headed finally for home. England's great hero, the pirate, adventurer, explorer, master navigator and bold soldier, was dead. His rather sad and ignominious end does not take anything away from his achievements, which were remarkable. He was a product of his age, of course, and his path was laid by men who came before him. Those Catholic sailors who first crossed the Atlantic, Pacific and Indian Oceans to establish colonies and trade routes. Also those Englishmen like Hawkins who paved the way for the English to partake in long-distance trade to distant continents. He was also part of a longer tradition of Devonshire mariners, pirates and smugglers, the hard men who came before him and who eventually made up his crews. And yet nothing Francis Drake achieved was inevitable. He was not born into a great family, he was not handed opportunities no one else had, and throughout his life he could always have settled for what he already had. When, as a young apprentice, he inherited a ship from his master, he could have had a comfortable life as a coastal trader. When he won his first fortune, he could have become a comfortable investor in the voyages of other men. After completing the circumnavigation, he could have retired from the sea as a gentleman, local dignitary and courtier. Time and again though, he strove always for more. He had an incredible, burning ambition to go further than other men, to do more than anyone else ever had, and to do it again and again. Paired with this unceasing energy was his sheer ability. As a navigator and a leader of rough men, both at sea and on land, he was loved by his men, who strove always to achieve the impossible, for England, for the Queen, and for God, but above all, for him. And he inspired his contemporaries to emulate his successes, which fueled the Elizabethan expansions across the globe and the first English colonies in North America. He continued to inspire Englishmen, especially English sailors, long after his death, and he became an icon of the transition of England from a small regional power to, in time, a global British Empire. And that's why, for so many of us, Sir Francis Drake remains England's greatest hero. If you enjoyed this story, please hit like, and if you want to see more videos like this in future, please subscribe to the channel. I will soon be making a video about Spain's greatest hero, so keep an eye out for that one. Thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel. If you enjoy my videos, please subscribe on Patreon to ensure I can keep making videos like this in future. Another great way of supporting the channel is by checking out the sponsor Surfshark VPN using the link in the description below. Now, please watch this video on the great medieval knight William Marshall. Thank you for watching.